gardens people are always having fun. Out there in the garden, in the rain and the sun.
Tan, thank you for the warm welcome. Also, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathering today on Wajak Noongar Budja. And I thank Dr. Richard Wally for that lovely and entertaining and warm and engaging welcome to country. And I think it's important that we stop and reflect the deep connection to country that First Nations people have, and also the generosity for engagement and forgiveness despite many horrible things in the past. And I think it's important at this point in time, with some pretty crazy conflict happening around the world, and sometimes some things that seem insurmountable in terms of challenges between different people, that one thing that we do have deep down in us is an ability to forgive and look forward. So I think that's worth reflecting on. My role for today is two things. Firstly, to say a few words on behalf of the Waste Authority. Are people familiar with the Waste Authority and what the Waste Authority does? I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't the case. I know there are a few hardcore sort of waste sector people like Peg and John and others who very much know what the Waste Authority is, but it's probably worth just touching upon the organisation, or the body rather, and what it does. So I'm a member of the Waste Authority. It's a statutory body that was established under the Waste Avoidance and Resource Recovery Act of Western Australia to provide guidance to the Minister for Environment on matters relating to waste, and in particular the development and deployment of the West Australian Waste Avoidance and Resource Recovery Strategy. We call it the Waste Strategy. It also administers the revenue that's collected as part of levies that is placed on landfill, for part of that money to go towards implementing the strategy to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill, and importantly, looking at resource recovery. So the state government, through that strategy, has quite an ambitious resource recovery goal of 75% resource recovery from all material generated as what we see waste at the moment by 2030. Now, that's actually an enormous task. So one of the things that the Waste Authority does is, in addition to funding some major programs like FOGO, which of course is the Food Organics, Garden Organics, third green littered bin, that is now up and running in 14 councils across WA, another 17 in transition to taking it on. And by 2025, the aim is to have all councils in WA, certainly Perth and Peel as the priority, where most of the waste is generated, to actually be implementing FOGO. Because we know to hit that target of 75% resource recovery by 2030, we need to have the diversion of both garden and food organics from landfill for recovery. So that reduces those volumes, but it also means that that material, which is hugely precious as community gardeners, you all know, and we get the carbon and we get the nutrients back into soil. And really the challenge is, how do we not just get it back into soil? How do we not just keep it out of holes in the ground where it produces methane and causes other problems? How do we put that to best use? And this is really important as we look towards aspiring to a circular economy. How do we get the material that's generated within urban environments, where the bulk of it's generated, back into enriched soils to enable things like food production and revegetation and creating amenity in public spaces? And there's some exciting things happening at scale. And Marcus Geisler, who of course is the CEO of the Eastern Metropolitan Regional Council, is speaking on the program today, and his talk is going to be focusing very much on the benefits of FOGO when it's done at scale, okay? And probably challenging some of those myths that are out there about cost and other things that naysayers are putting up. So he's been a real champion for FOGO. He's a former chair of the Waste Authority, and now in that role really helping to drive the implementation of FOGO with local councils. But the other thing that the Waste Authority does in addition to programs looking at trying to increase recycling of plastics and cardboard and glass and all those tricky things, looking at programs to divert construction and demolition waste from stockpiling and landfill back into things like road construction. It's one of the biggest volumes of waste material generated in urban environments. But the other thing it does is, through its waste sorted program, is engage with community to help support initiatives like this one today. And it's a Waste Authority grant that's helped contribute to today's event. And that's really, really important, not just to acknowledge the great work that's done by the WA Community Gardens Network, but also here at Earthwise. It's about supporting those people who are champions in the community around waste avoidance and resource recovery, which is all of you guys. And hopefully these small contributions and the acknowledgement that comes from Waste Authority to events like this help to further support and amplify your amazing voices out in the community. And I know, looking around, there are some people that I've known for 25 odd years working in this space who are tirelessly promoting the importance of resource recovery and waste avoidance, and doing so in a deep way. It's not just about recycling, it's not just about dealing with things end of pipe, it's about fundamentally challenging this concept of waste. How do we reduce to start with? How do we reassess what we're consuming? How do we rethink how we're designing our systems of production? And also reassessing what our real needs are, so we're not generating stuff in the first place. And I think that type of deep thinking ferments and grows and gets cultivated in networks like this one, and at community gardens all around the state and indeed the country. So well done. And it was interesting, when I was first arriving, I was asked, had I ever been to Earthwise before? I'm from WA, as you know. I live down near Fremantle, but I actually grew up just down the road in Subiaco. And I first came to Earthwise in 1996, when it was still relatively new, and I did my Permaculture design course here as part of the then International Permaculture Conference and Convergence, which was held in Perth. And there was a 2-week permaculture design course that was set up to run with some amazing teachers and facilitators, and the main facilitator, of course, was Dora Byrne, who's also here. So we had most of our classes in this very room, and lots of the workshops out and about in the gardens here. And it was a visit that we took to Murdoch University's Environmental Technology Centre back in 1996, where I was already studying environmental science, but had never been to the ETC at the back of campus. It was that visit to that site as part of the permaculture course that made me discover what an opportunity to actually start applying some of the things that I was learning in my environmental science degree with the hands-on development of a site, including the permaculture landscape, all of the integrated water systems, the renewable energy systems that were being tested there, and the sustainable construction methods. So that set off quite a new path for me. I ended up not only studying at Murdoch for 3 degrees, including a PhD, but I also worked there for 10 years as the site coordinator for the ETC, responsible for its design and installation, but also running the community garden there, which we had a voluntary group called Muppets, which was Murdoch University Permaculture and Environmental Technology Society. So we had volunteers, we had students, people from the local community, and people on various training programs. So for me, that was my deep dive into what it's like being involved in a community garden, albeit one that also had a very serious R&D agenda around the rest of the site and interfacing with all sorts of interesting programs, including those in remote communities and overseas. So I guess just in wrapping up, it's very dear to me, community gardens. I've been fortunate to visit many over the years, to design some, to volunteer in some, but also run the Murdoch one for a long time. So I know how much work's involved. It doesn't happen easy. There are often challenges that seem hard to overcome with local government and funding and volunteers, but the fact that you organise and get together in networks like this one makes it all possible. So good on you. Look, without further ado, it's probably time for me to introduce the key act for this morning anyway, and that is Luke Wheat. he's going to share his story about a very exciting and innovative approach to basically maximising the most out of organic material, and very much in line with what I mentioned before about it's more than just recycling it so it doesn't go into a hole. How do we value add? How do we make the most of this material? And Luke's here to share his story. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Josh. Bit of an honour being introduced by a pioneer in the space and someone who's sort of certainly been leading the way in sustainability and recycling. First of all, before I introduce myself further, thanks again to the organisers and sponsors. Thanks to Dr. Richard Wally. He's having a wander, but I think the acknowledgement of country is particularly important when we're gathering today to talk about how we care better for our country in a modern context. So thanks for that. So I'm Luke Wheat. I'm the founder and managing director of a company called Future Green Solutions. And as sort of Josh has spoken about, I guess why our company formed was to challenge the business as usual for waste and how people think about it. And so rather than what a waste, I thought I'd pose the question, what waste? So how can a fly create a circular economy? I think this will be, the black soldier fly will be central to my conversation today. So although not part of a community garden, I think the drivers and the passion behind this project are certainly well aligned with community gardens and backyard gardeners alike. So to get into it, perhaps we'll start with the business as usual of how our food system works and what it looks like. Our current food production system, I think is fair to say, is extremely complex. There's a lot of figures and it's a bit of a web of waste along the way and inefficiencies through either losses at farm gate from cosmetic rejection, 15 to 20% on horticulture because we don't like the look of things. And then as we go further down that food production into animal production, the diversion of edible food crops into larger livestock like beef, lambs, pork, poultry. We also lose that sort of valuable nutrient and energy through feed conversion. So this is sort of in a bit more context when I was speaking of those inefficiencies. So when we look at land use and feed conversion, energy use, water use, it's quite phenomenal how much is put into producing 1 kilo of food when we talk about a meat-based system. And I'm certainly not advocating that we move away from these. I'm simply highlighting that this is some areas where there's some need for change, whether it be how we can become more efficient with the land, but probably more specifically from our perspective, how do we make these industries, like particularly the swine industry and the poultry industry, more sustainable via the feed inputs that are used in those markets? And so the system as it stands is largely a linear system. So it's all about input, production, output. And those outputs unfortunately include a lot of waste. I think the other thing, the point to make, and again ties back to Josh's comment about the uncertainty in the globe at the moment, is that a lot of our farming systems are really at the peril of commodity prices, which can be, we've seen fertiliser prices go through the roof with the tension in Ukraine. And all of these things sort of point back to how can we localise and add more security to our systems, and not so much rely on these external pressures to drive how we farm our food. So I guess this is our traditional system where it's inputs in, how can we squeeze as much out of our land as possible, and then what comes out the end. And there's not really a lot of thought sometimes on maybe how we can make those efficient, particularly again when the drivers are margins, which are squeezed tighter by things like fertiliser prices and the like. So introducing the black soldier fly. I fell in love with this fly over a decade ago. I was drawn to it. Myself and my now wife were travelling. We'd both been working in the resource sector as environmental consultants. We were frustrated with climate. We were frustrated that things weren't being done at scale. but probably also frustrated that typically sustainability projects relied a lot on philanthropy and people's enthusiasm, both of which are fairly exhaustive. And so the question for us was, how can we monetise sustainability so that it can be done sustainably from an economic perspective and be done at scale, which with the urgency of need for change, scale is absolutely key in changing the way that we do things. So the black soldier fly it's a tropical fly. It was introduced into Australia, they think, around the 60s or 70s. It's not known as a pest fly. The adults don't have a feeding mouth part. And essentially what that means is that as a larval form, like a bear going into hibernation, they need to stock up on as much protein and fat as they possibly can to survive through the rest of their life. And it's that life trait, essentially, that, for lack of a better term, we're exploiting. So what's our process? So our feedstock is waste, organic waste. And I'll make some sort of claims about what they can eat, and then I'll drive down to what we actually accept in our current system. So the beauty of black soldier fly larvae is that they're a very non-select feeder. So unlike worms or other insects, they're a generalist. They'll eat and convert anything from manures, human biosolids, meat waste, dairy waste, fruit, vegetable, grain. What they're not so good at is the more garden organics, so leafy twigs and cellulose-based waste. But all those other organic waste streams are very rapidly converted. Our business model, or our current business model, and the first business model that we're looking to launch, is around what we call clean waste organics. And the reason for that is that on the other end of our process, and I guess the beauty and where we challenge the current status quo on waste management, is that we're able to leverage a very, very large diversity of high-value products at the other end. And those include protein and fat for the animal feed market. So that's where we can look at replacing things like wild-caught fish meal and soybean meals, which are clearly, quite unsustainable in their own right. A fertiliser import, which is essentially the soldier fly version of castings, worm castings. Where am I going? So because we're going into a feed market, there's certain biosecurity concerns if we're using animal manures to go back into animal feeds. So for that reason, for our first facility, we're only looking at organic waste that doesn't include farm mortalities or manures. So we're largely based on horticulture waste, grain wastes, so farm gate all the way through the food supply chain, food processors, and then post-consumer waste streams as well. So a little bit more on our products. So essentially, once the insects are introduced onto the waste, it's a very, very rapid process. So the waste that comes through our door today is out the door in 6 days as product. So their growth is phenomenal. From hatch to harvest, they put on about 10,000 times their weight. So imagine growing an 8-tonne chook in a fortnight, and you're just about there. So the proteins are very highly digestible, and I'll go in a little bit more detail of the trials and things that we've done for a bit more real-world application. The oils are super high in lauric acids. Very much like a coconut oil, of all things, is probably our closest comparison from a nutritional perspective. The frass, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail later, again, that's our technical term for the insect poo. So miniature manure. Is a bit of a funny beast, and I'll go into that in a little while because I think it's probably most applicable to your gardening world. And then some carbon offset as well, particularly where we're diverting away from landfill. And then beyond these, we're also very close to launching some other cosmetic and pharmaceutical elements that we can extract from the fly. So all in all, it's a zero waste process in itself. So everything that comes through the door is going out as saleable product. So where does our product sit? So our main markets, and certainly the markets where we're going to have the biggest sustainability impact, starting with aquaculture. So aquaculture relies quite heavily on wild-caught fish meal. In the Australian aquaculture market, that is largely imported from places like the Southern Americas and Seychelles. These fisheries are capped currently from a quota perspective, but also from a longer term climate resilience and health of the oceans perspective, those caps are likely to be drawn down further. While there's extremely rapid growth in the aquaculture sector. And so aside from wanting to move away from fish meal as an unsustainable feedstock, there's also a huge void of how we're going to feed these fish if we can't feed them wild caught fish. And so we've conducted numerous long-term trials at full commercial scale where we've substituted the fish meal component of that diet for a insect-based protein. So our proteins are a minimum of 65% protein, so they're very high protein, they're very highly digestible. And we looked across all of the mechanisms that a commercial aquaculture facility would look at. So is the protein substitution going to reduce our feed conversion, so essentially our operational efficiency? What are the economic impacts of using insect meal over fish meal? Is there any implication on fish health? Is there implication on the quality and texture and taste of the fillet? Because ultimately I think people buying fish don't really want to be eating an insect if it comes to the taste of it, particularly in Western society. But the great news is that we found that there was absolutely no impact across any of those commercial markets, which means that there's a big demand now from the aquaculture market to say, hey, we can really rapidly reduce our use of fish meal in aquaculture by using insect proteins as an alternative. And for me, this is one of the mechanisms in the thinking of why we came up with this business. It was, how do we change the food system? How do we change consumer behaviour without the consumer actually having to change at all? Which I think is a really powerful tool because changing behaviours can be a very hard thing. And so if we can do that behind closed doors and have that impact at scale, then all the better. Another interesting thing with our oils, that high lauric acid content that I spoke about, we've done some trials with weaner pigs. So these are pigs that are transitioning from their mother's milk onto their first solid diets. Unfortunately, that's a very harsh transition, and quite often there's issues with gut health, severe diarrhoea and mortality at that stage. That's traditionally combated with antibiotics and things like zinc oxides, which also then end up in our agricultural soils through the manures and have flow-on effects. So we looked at, can we improve the probiotic impacts of weaner diets using the high lauric acid content in our oils? And what we found is that we can actually completely replace the zinc oxide in weaner rations and at the same time completely eliminate severe diarrhoea. So we know that we can improve animal health as well as have those environmental benefits. So again, changing kind of the husbandry, the animal health and overall farming system without the consumer at the other end not even knowing about it, but having a much healthier product on the shelf. And then finally, pet food. So we currently have a couple of clients that have dog kibble out on the market, which the only animal-based protein in those is insect protein from Future Green Solutions. And this is another probably, more recently comes to the forefront of people's mind, but certainly the footprint of our animals can sometimes be fairly significant. And so again, to be able to make that sustainability change, not just for yourself in the household, but also for your pet, then we can have a greater reach. So the frass, if I'm honest, we're still trying to understand it. On a nutritional perspective, it looks a bit like a really premium grade compost, but when we put it in the soil, it behaves much more like a plant stimulant, a biostimulant, and a fertiliser, although it certainly does not have the nutrient load of a fertiliser. So we've done extensive trials across broadacre, pasture crops and horticulture, and probably the biggest things that we've seen, so in these broadacre crops, we still gave the same level of base urea that would be used in that production system, but we increased the application of frass as well. And so what we're seeing is that frass is holding the applied urea in that soil for longer, and it's also increasing the plant availability of those soil nitrogens. And so what we're hoping, again, is that we can show that for the same yields, and we actually had some incredible yield increases using the frass in combination with urea, is that can we reduce the reliance on synthetics to achieve the same yield, or can we couple those synthetics with frass to improve greater yield and reduce the land area required for the same yield. The other really great thing about it, it's very high in carbon. It's quite a fluffy material in its raw form, and it's very great at holding onto water. And so, in the horticulture trials, we did tomatoes and celery and had similar results across both, where we had irrigated systems and then we subjected them to a drought tolerance. And you can clearly see, as we increase the percentage of frass in the potting soil, the plants are far more resilient simply because it's holding the water in that soil a lot better. And so this year we plan to do some trials with the horticulture industry to the north of Perth, where water licences will eventually be restricted. So can we help that industry transition to lower water use but not impact on yield? So that's sort of our next challenge, but I think we'll have some good results in that regard. So going back to the business as usual with the insert of an insect facility, it's a much more circular story. So those waste products can be utilised through the insect system and be pushed back into cropping and horticulture via the soil amendments and go back into the feed product side as well. And so we can continue to recycle and recapture those nutrients that would otherwise be lost to landfill, and make sure that we're maximising the flow of that, and essentially just self-perpetuating that through. So again, impact really now with the urgency of climate change and the need to change our system, in my mind, is about scale. And so we need to take what we know and do these things at an industrial scale so that we can start to hit targets like those mentioned by Josh earlier. They sound ambitious, but in my mind, I'm quite optimistic. I'm certainly not saying that this is the silver bullet, but it will be part of an abundance of new technology that will help us hit those targets as we move through the next decade. So Future Green Solutions have now commercialised the process. We'll start building our first big facility. It'll be located in Mouchet, and we'll have that commissioned by mid next year. And at full capacity, we'll be able to process over 300 tonnes of organic waste a day. So significant volume. So that's about 8,000 tonnes of protein per annum, and close to 20,000 tonnes of soil amendment as well. So again, just closing off, how does a fly create a circular economy? Hopefully I've captured it. It's quite a simplistic process in some regards and sophisticated in others. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, I suppose we're just farmers. And yeah, certainly please follow our journey. We're on sort of most social platforms. We like to share a lot of the research that's being done and sort of some of the quirkier sides of our insects. But yeah, thanks very much for your time today. Much appreciated.
They give the gardens their love, they're helping things to grow.
So the first question was, where can we get some samples of frass?
Yeah, so we're currently not selling the frass product directly, but we are working with the Green Life Soil Company. So have a yarn with the guys out there, and they'll be able to put you in with some.
The question was, how can someone access the black soldier fly? And I'm guessing, can they be set up as small systems at home?
Yeah, so there's a lot of information online now about how to set up a simple system at home, and in actual fact they were featured on Gardening Australia within the last couple of years, I believe. Yeah. So you may have seen them in your compost already. They're quite a large, more of a grub-looking larvae than what you would think of as your traditional maggot. And so they are found around Perth, usually in the warmer summer months. We did used to supply them live for people to get started, but unfortunately just the nature of where we're moving, we don't no longer do that. But certainly I'm sure from a community garden perspective we could help facilitate that, and then members of the community could perhaps use that as their supply. I've
got some larvae in my compost, one of our compost bins at the moment, and I've seen adults flying around at the moment too, so they are out there. So the question was about your logistics, accessing material and transport. Yeah, so valid question.
So we have two business as usuals for our waste. So and Muche, while it sounds far away, is sort of strategically located between the metropolitan waste and that sort of peri-urban strip through Bunuru, Muche, Gingin for horticulture. And so for horticulture, the business as usual for their waste streams is often trying to get rid of it to a cattle farmer or spreading it on a paddock and hoping something eats it or burying it on site. But it's not seen as a cost. So for farm gate waste producers, our conversations are that Future Green will provide very large skip bins, and we will organise all of the logistics for no cost to the farmer. But for metropolitan waste, we've also got a partnership with one of the larger waste logistics companies. And so really it's around us offering a far better package than sort of traditional levied disposal options, so that there's a cost saving to the waste producer and a security of waste on our side.
You're not allowed to ask who that is yet?
No, I can't yet, sorry. You could probably have a guess. Yeah, so at the moment we're largely targeting more of those high volume streams. So some of the farm gate waste is sort of in excess of 20 tonnes a day, year round, and then some of the food processors through the metro area as well that are sort of in that 5 to 10 tonne a day. I'm hoping that once we've sort of proven the technology at scale, we can start to expand the conversation more for sort of the restaurant and the residential waste, but there's sort of challenges there around volume, contamination and things which I'm sure Josh is well aware of. The beauty for us on the large volume is that there's limited logistics, and particularly from a contamination perspective, we don't really have to worry too much. Unfortunately, as everyone at Community Gardens probably knows, that it doesn't matter how many times you tell people, there's all sorts of things that ends up in a rubbish bin.
Can I ask a question? You're obviously an early mover in this space. We've seen examples of small operations for backyards and home aquaponics setups and that type of thing as feedstock. Do you think this will become a competitive space, and do you think we'll get to a point where the large volumes of commercial horticultural waste at the moment, that's a problem to deal with, there'll be competition for that as feedstock for businesses like yours who are value adding and having a resource to sell at the end?
Yeah, I think absolutely it'll become a really busy space. I think the great thing about the challenges that we've got globally at the moment is that it is pushing for innovation. So be it our process or something similar where they're recovering other valuable resources for waste, I think the dynamic in the way that we think of waste as a cost will rapidly change over the next decade. Internationally, from an insect perspective, there's been some really big movers in the last 2 to 3 years. So there's some very well industrialised plants overseas that are already, processing over a couple of 100 tonne of waste a day. So it's technology that's been tested and proven overseas. Domestically, we're certainly kind of the first mover at that scale, but there'll be certainly more to come.
Well done. How are we going for time for questions?
We're pretty tight. Maybe one more.
Okay, do we have a burning question?
Could you help me understand how you get the protein out of as the end product?
Yeah, so we use the same technology as they use for a lot of canola oil, fish meal production. Essentially, think of a giant heated centrifuge. So we use a gravity force to separate the 3 phases of the product, which is the protein, the oil, and a water phase.
So is that from the actual plant or the...
It's from the larvae, yeah. So it's the larvae that do all the work, and we maintain a breeding colony on site, and they're super efficient breeders. So we've only got to hold back about 1% of total production for breeding.
Do you have an entomologist on the team?
Surprisingly, we don't, but we do have a food technologist who sort of is really jumping into the nutrition side of insects, and more recently a geneticist as well.
Are they fairly robust in terms of managing breeding cycles and that populations over the cooler months, knowing that they're a warm weather insect?
Yeah, robust as long as we're providing the right climate. So
Okay.
So climate is king for these guys. Yeah.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Luke Week for a fantastic presentation.
Thanks, Josh.
And also just acknowledging that getting to where you are now and on the verge of commercialising, it's been a 10-year journey. And for yourself and your partner, you mentioned you left the resource sector and all of the short-term financial benefits that sector provides to do a deep dive into an area that is desperately needed, I wish you all the very best commercial success. So good on you. Well done.
Thanks very much.